Hey, everybody. I pray you're well, that, you're taking good care of yourself, that you're staying inside. I know it's been several weeks now. I think we're in our fourth or fifth week of the pandemic, and I know it feels like forever. And I just want you to continue to take care of yourself. We're not out of the woods yet. There's still the possibility of contracting this virus, and you're very important to me. And I want to make sure that you're quarantining yourself, making good preparations if you have to go out, wearing a mask, and just being vigilant about continuing to follow the procedures. This will be over soon. We'll be back to some normal semblance of life. I don't know if we'll be back to everything the way it was. When things like this happen, change takes place. And so some things may be different for us. But my prayer is that you're doing what you need to do for you. I'll say this again, you're important to me. I've been reading in the book of 2 Kings. May I encourage you to take the time during this season to spend time with God. And I don't mean just reading His Word as far just to like you're reading a book, but specifically asking the Lord to speak to your heart and give you wisdom and insight as you read His Word. And that He will speak to you and give you some things about life now, maybe even some things about our future and what's to come. And so I encourage you to take the time while you have it now to engross yourself in God's Word. I've got my Bible down here with me. I'm reading in 2 Kings. I read yesterday in 2 Kings chapter 5 about a man who lived with an issue. It wasn't a virus. Maybe some people say it is. But he had a disease. And he was a great leader. He had good leadership skills. One of the best leadership skills to me of a good leader is a leader who follows somebody. And this man honored his leader and his master. And that was the king of Aram. This man was not a follower of God. He served his own gods in the country where he was. He worshiped the gods of his king, his master. But yet he had leprosy. And it's a very contagious disease. Those of us know anything about leprosy know in the 40s and 50s and some maybe even as early as the 30s, lepers were ostracized. They were quarantined, to use a word from today. They were left to die with their disease. There was no cure. Still, I don't think there's a cure for leprosy. Leprosy left your skin in a white, scaly form. It something like psoriasis, but a lot worse. It affected your ability to be able to feel. You get what medically is called peripheral neuropathy, which means you lose the feeling in your fingers and in your toes, and your extremities, to the point that it gets bad enough they can become gangrenous and start to die. These people were ostracized. In Jesus' day, if you were a leper and you were walking down the street and you ran into some other people that were coming towards you We talk about the 6 foot, staying away from people from 6 foot today. When the lepers saw people coming, they would raise their hands and go, "Leper, leper." And so the people would stay away from them so the disease wouldn't become contagious. But this man's name was Naaman, and he was a great leader of the army of Aram. He had conquered nations. They had actually conquered Israel and gone in there and defeated them. The king of Israel was still in charge, but this king answered to the king of Aram, and the king of Israel knew that at any time that the Arameans wanted anything, they just came and got it. The Israelites were subservient to the Arameans. And one of the things that happened during this time, when you conquered a land, you took prisoners, you took slaves, you brought people back to your country to serve you. This subservient thing that they did was a way to demean the people, to keep them in check, to let them know that the conquerors were in control. And so Naaman, he brought this little girl back. Today in our culture, we'd call it kidnapping. But he brought this little girl. From the story, when I read the story, it says a young girl. She may have been in her late single digits or no older than her early teens, 10, 11, 12 years old. And he brought her back. He took her from her parents. And she became the servant of Naaman's wife. And so that we can understand this story and it makes sense to us, I want you to understand something about this little girl. We have this idea today that we need to let children figure things out for themselves. Be careful about teaching them one way or another. Let them explore and come up with their own ideas. And back in that day, little girls weren't privy to education. The boys would have been educated in the Word of God and in the Torah, but not the little girls. But this little girl had been taught something about God. She may have not been a part of the education, but she'd listened to the stories of her parents and grandparents as they talked about the great things that God did. And back in that day, oral tradition was very big. So she would have heard the stories. And she lived in the same house with Naaman, who is this leper. And one day, this little girl looked at her mistress, Naaman's wife, and said, "I so wish my master knew about the prophet in Israel, because I believe this prophet could help my master and make him well." Now, when you're taken captive by somebody, you're subservient to them, you have to do what they do. The majority of the time, you are not excited about being there. You're angry. You're mad at them. You want revenge because they've taken your life away. But this little girl, I believe because of her understanding of Yahweh, the God of Israel, loved her mistress and her master. And she had chosen to serve him. We live in this situation right now during this pandemic where we go, "God, I don't understand why you're doing this." Some of us may be angry because the things we love have been taken away from us. Some of my public safety brothers and sisters have been away from their children because they're afraid of the environment that we're in on a daily basis, that our children could contract the disease. So they're social distancing even from their children. And here is this little girl who has chosen to look at the situation she's in. And maybe she had heard the story of Joseph. And where the story was told, where Joseph looked at his brothers and said, what you meant for evil, God has used for good. And maybe this little girl realized that this is where she was, and that she wanted to use it for the best. And so she shared this information. And evidently one evening, Naaman's wife said to him, hey, this little girl, my little servant, he said that there's a man in Israel who could make you well. Maybe they were lying in the bed at night, getting ready to go to sleep. And of course, Naaman's thoughts are on his duties as the senior ruler of the army. He's thinking about all those things. And all of a sudden, his wife just out of the blue brings up this subject, and he goes, yeah, really? Okay. But the one thing Naaman wanted more than anything else was to be whole. He wanted to be a regular person. And as he thought through that process, sometimes we'll do just about anything to be whole. We will go to other countries to seek treatments for diseases, cancer. We'll take experimental treatments. We'll say to the doctor, is there anything out there? We don't even know if it works, but I'm willing to try it so I can live. And as Naaman thought about what his wife had said, maybe the next day he is with the king and they're discussing things. And he says, hey, my little servant girl tells me that there may be a man in Israel who can heal me. And the king says, well, let's go for it. I mean, what have you got to lose? And he says, I'll write a letter to the king of Israel and tell him to whatever he needs to do to make this happen for you so that you can be well. And so Naaman loads up silver and gold, enough to live off of for a long, long time, and nice clothing. You got to think the Israelites at this point are living in degradation. They're subservient to the Arameans, and they probably don't have a lot. And here Naaman brings all these nice clothes. They had to be nice clothes because he was royalty. He was the leader of the army. He loads it all up, and he takes his entourage with him. This is not just Naaman going with a couple of soldiers. When Naaman travels, he travels with the best. He travels with a large constituent that goes with him. And so they take off for Israel, and they get there. He goes to see the king. I'm sure the king is concerned because here's the leader of the army of the people who have brought them under their rule. And he comes inside and he hands the letter from the king, and the king of Israel reads the letter, and he just explodes. He rips his clothes off, and that day was a sign of mourning, and he throws ashes up in the air, which is a sign of mourning and just utter dismay. And he looks over at Naaman and he says, who does your king think I am? Some god? And of course, during that day, it wasn't unusual for leaders of nations to think themselves as gods. The Romans did it, and it happened a long time before them. And so this king of Israel says to Naaman, you think I'm a god? And he's scared because he's afraid that if he can't produce what Naaman wants, that it could cost him his life, or they could pull him from his job, and they could put somebody else in there. He could be thrown out and with the poor people. I mean, all these thoughts are going through his head. And as I read this passage, it's amazing to me how the king of Israel, the country, the people that God has set aside as his people to love and to be the ones to be the ambassador of God's love, this leader of Israel does not even consider that God would come to his rescue. And so while all this is going on, that prophet in the day, in this story in 2 Kings chapter 5, is Elisha. This was Elijah's protege. Elijah is gone. We know the story about him being taken off in the whirlwind into heaven, and Elisha took his place. And Elisha's in his home. And he sends a messenger to the king during this time. Naaman's still there, and this messenger goes and comes before the king, and he says, I've heard that Naaman is here. Wonder how you found out. He says, tell Naaman to come see me. And I'm sure there was a relief in the king of Israel's heart. He's going, woo, I got out of that one. He doesn't really care that it's the prophet. He just wants out of the situation. You see, the king of Israel at this time, because he doesn't follow God, cares about one thing. He cares about one thing in his life. That's himself. You know, as we deal with this pandemic right now, one of the things we have to be really, really careful about, and we've read the stories and I've listened to them on the news, excuse me, about the things that people are doing. I saw a story the other day about a little boy that's washing cars, and he's using the money to help people during this time who are out of work, and just a lot of different things that he's done. I saw a story of people who are making the masks so that people can have masks to wear, and just a lot of good things going on. But to be real honest with you, our major concern is about us. It's about ourselves, taking care of us. That's the mentality of us as human beings. And that was the king's mentality. Take care of me. So Naaman loads up his entourage, and they travel down the road, and Elisha's living in Samaria. And so he goes to the city, and he gets there, and his entourage. I mean, can you imagine being in this area and seeing this large Aramean entourage coming down the street? And as they come down the street, they wonder, are they coming to take more of our children? Did they hide? Did they think, oh my goodness, this is the end, they're going to destroy us? And this large company of people pull up in front of Elisha's house. Naaman's in his chariot. He's got other chariots with him and soldiers, and just think about everything that would travel with him. His cooks, his people who carried the garments, his servants. We're just talking about a large amount of people. And here he pulls up in front of the house, and you know, you got to understand, Naaman thinks he's something. I mean, he is something. And in his mind, he expects Elisha to walk out of the house and raise his hands up in the air and speak some great spiritual saying, and do something abracadabra, magic thing, and go, poof, you're healed. And as he's waiting for Elisha to come out, this attendant walks out of the house, and he walks up to Naaman, and he says, Elisha has a message for you. You need to go to the Jordan River here in Israel, and you need to wash yourself or dip yourself in the water 7 times, and when you come up, you'll be healed. Your leprosy will be gone. And this attendant turns around and walks right back in the house. I mean, Naaman's livid. I mean, he is just, where's the pomp and circumstance for such a great leader? It's all about me. That's Naaman's attitude. Same attitude as the king. You see, it doesn't matter today whether we're in the church or out of the church. The attitude's the same. Remember, it's that radio station. You ever heard of it? I think I've shared this with you before. WIIFM. You ever listen to that radio station? What's in it for me? And we live in that attitude in that situation today. And so Naaman just blows up. I can almost see him cussing and just ranting and raving, and all of his constituents, his soldiers, his attendants, they're kind of moving back out of the way. We're going to let him rant and rave. We've seen him do this before. Let's just let him get it out of his system. And they're just quiet. They're not saying anything to him. And I can see Naaman saying, let's just get out of here. and just picking up his entourage and turning around and just stewing in his chariot. And Naaman yells out the name of a couple of rivers in his country and said, those are cleaner rivers than that old sorry, mucky Jordan. Reminds me of the log landing that we used to go to as a kid. How murky and muddy that water is compared to some clean pool someplace else. And finally, when he calms down a little bit, his servants walk up to him and say, sir, can we just ask a question? Would you just think about something for just a minute? And, to me, one of the signs of a great leader is that he's willing to listen to those people he leads. It's not all about him. And Naaman had this attitude. And so he says, okay, go ahead. He said, if Elisha had come out of the house and asked you to do some great thing, go give money away or go back and stand before the people in Aram and say something to them, whatever he'd ask you to do. If it was a great thing, would you go do it? And Naaman said, absolutely, I'd do it. He said, then why is it so hard just to go do what Elisha says? If Elisha says you can be whole, what difference does it make? And here's another sign of a great leader. He just doesn't listen to those he leads. He takes their advice. So Naaman thinks about this for just a minute, and he looks at his entourage, and he looks at the soldier who is driving his chariot, and he said, take me to the Jordan. And he gets to the Jordan, and I don't know if he strips down to his underwear or whether he went in his full regalia, I don't know, but he walks into the Jordan River, and I can kind of see him kind of like the corner of Ebenezer Creek when we used to go down there. You remember when you first walked into the creek, you walked into that just yucky, mucky mud, and when you stepped in it, you stirred it up, and the water would just go brownish orange, and you'd see all that stirring taking place, and you'd kind of walk out a little further, and one of the things about going down there was you couldn't see anything past the top of the water. I mean, you're in the water, could be anything under there. You don't know what you're walking on. And I could see Naaman walking out into the Jordan River there where it was just dirty from just the stirring of the mud, and he gets out into the middle of the river, gets about waist deep, and he feels like an idiot. Here's all of his entourage up there looking at him. Here's this great man, this great leader from this country, and he is dipping himself in the water. He goes down once, and he comes up, and he's soaking wet, and he goes down twice, and he comes up, and he's soaking wet, and he goes down a third time, and he comes back up, and he's thinking, this is the most stupid thing I've ever done in my life. And he's wet, and he's standing before his people, and he just continues to feel more like a stupid person. Fourth time and up. Fifth time and up. Sixth time and up. Seventh time.